Earlier today, 32-year-old Calocane was sentenced to detention in a high-security hospital after admitting manslaughter by diminished responsibility. The judge said he might never be released.
They were almost home when you attacked them. What followed was truly shocking. You first pulled out a dagger from the bag you were carrying and set about Barnaby in a frenzied and relentless stabbing attack. With astonishing bravery, Grace tried to save him by pushing you away. She sacrificed her life in the attempt, as you then dealt with her in the same brutal fashion.
Speaking outside the court after the sentencing, the mother of 19-year-old Barnaby Webber told Nottinghamshire Police, "You have blood on your hands."
True justice has not been served today. We as a devastated family have been let down by multiple agency failings and ineffectiveness. The CPS did not consult with us, as has been reported. Instead, we have been rushed, hastened and railroaded. We do not dispute that the murderer is mentally unwell and has been for a number of years. However, the premeditated planning, the collection of lethal weapons, hiding in the shadows and the brutality of the attacks are of an individual who knew exactly what he was doing. He knew entirely that it was wrong, but he did it anyway. This has been a trial by doctors. To the Assistant Chief Constable, Rob Griffin, who finally released this information publicly yesterday, I say this: you have blood on your hands. If you had just done your jobs properly, there's a very good chance my beautiful boy would be alive today.
Police have also released chilling footage from the dreadful day in June last year when the attacks took place. They show his victims, friends, Grace O'Malley, Kumar and Barnaby Webber, walking home from a night out moments before Calocane emerged from the shadows. The footage also shows his brutal journey around Nottingham, dressed all in black. As well as killing 3 people, including school caretaker Ian Coates, Calocane also injured 3 others. And this is the dramatic moment he was lasered and arrested by police following the attacks. Joining me now, a criminal barrister, Jeremy Dean, KC, and forensic psychiatrist, Dr. Serm Das. Thank you both very much indeed for joining me. Let me talk to Jeremy Dean first of all about this. Jeremy Dean, you know, we've heard the family in the absolute full, brutal onset of the most agonising pain of bereavement and shock and loss. I mean, they're suffering so badly, obviously. But we hear them say, this is not justice. This is not right. This is not appropriate. This man deliberately, brutally set out to murder. He went and bought a knife. He knew what he was doing. He planned it. How can this be the verdict? And how can a hospital stay be the sentence? And I hope that you'll be able to explain what the judge was thinking and how this kind of sentence has come about.
Well, Vanessa, first of all, I want to stress, what a horrific case this was, and nothing I'm about to explain is designed to undermine that. But what we've seen here is the criminal justice process functioning, and on the face of it, I'm afraid to say functioning in a predictable fashion. Firstly, I think the issues have to be separated out. Clearly, the family are deeply unhappy with communications from the CPS. That's a discrete matter, and that's the sort of complaint that is often made by victims. Secondly, the family are bitterly disappointed with the police, and that is a separate matter, and I've no doubt that they have good reason to feel that there were police failings on the basis of what I have read. The principal issue is the sentence. The process with regard to diminished responsibility is a complicated one. A person is deemed guilty of manslaughter rather than murder if their responsibility is substantially impaired by mental illness. The process involves the prosecution and defense instructing psychiatrists who confer as to whether that impairment did in fact exist. Clearly, in this case, there was agreement between prosecution and defense, which enabled the process to reduce liability to manslaughter. And the judge in those circumstances, Vanessa, has no option but to proceed on that basis. And furthermore, when the diagnosis is one of paranoid psychosis, as it was here, and the parties agree that responsibility is for manslaughter rather than murder, then a high security hospital order is in fact the appropriate sentence by law. If I could just say this finally, of course I feel desperately for the family, but if they think that this is an easy option, it's not. This guy will be detained in the harshest of environments for the rest of his life, almost certainly. The only other option would have been life imprisonment. And, you know, if he's transferred to prison at the end of his sentence, if he's transferred to prison at the end of his sentence, so be it. But he's likely to be in the highest possible hospital environment until he dies.
Thank you for that. Let me bring in Dr. Sermdas on this one. Obviously, people need some kind of explanation, Doctor, about diminished responsibility and what that means. Yeah. What mental illness could have caused him to do this? Is he psychotic? Is he completely delusional? And then people realise that he went and bought the knife in a perfectly competent, you might say in inverted commas, normal way. You know, you go and buy lamb chops, you buy a pound of apples, you buy a knife. Can you do that if you're in the grips of a severe psychotic mental illness? How does he seem to have systematically planned this and carried it out while at the same time being of diminished responsibility? Maybe you can explain.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I think there's two slightly different issues that maybe the general public might be confusing. So one is the insanity plea. Not guilty by reason of insanity means somebody is found in the eyes of the law not to be guilty because they didn't know what they were doing or they didn't know what they were doing was wrong, right? Everybody is saying, the judge is saying, that the psychiatrist is saying that Calocane didn't meet that threshold. So I do think he knew what he was doing. But at the same time, I also think that his responsibility was diminished. So he has a lesser charge of manslaughter than murder. So not the insanity plea, but diminished responsibility. As Jeremy said himself, it's about substantial impairment of specific factors like understanding the nature of his conduct, which he probably did, forming a rational judgment, which I don't think he did, and the ability to exercise self-control, which I also think was limited. So to answer your question, we know from the psychiatric reports that he has long-term psychotic beliefs. Specifically, from what I've read, he was hearing voices telling him that he had to kill members of the public, otherwise his own family would be hurt. And he felt compelled to do this, otherwise he thought something bad would happen because of his schizophrenia, because of his psychosis. So I do think, even though he knew he was buying a knife, and even though he knew he'd be going to prison, in his mind, he was motivated by psychotic beliefs. And another way of saying that, I guess, Vanessa, is, in my opinion, from what I've read, had he not had those symptoms of mental illness, he wouldn't have gone out and killed those people so brutally that day.
I mean, it's such a difficult one, I think, for members of the public to understand, because you could almost say, couldn't you, that anybody who kills anybody has some kind of madness about them, because otherwise why would anyone in their right mind take life? Why would you do that if you were in full command of your faculties, if you understood completely what you were doing and what the impact of what you were doing was going to be? How could any sane person kill another person? You might say that. In the case of Lucy Letby, for example, you might say, well, she must have been absolutely severely and probably dementedly mentally ill. Otherwise, how could you deliberately kill baby after baby on a neonatal unit? You would have to be insane to do that. Only we don't think that in British law, do we? We think that there's mad and bad. And some people are deliberately sane and evil killers, and some people are insane and have diminished responsibility. So maybe you can explain how we differentiate between the very bad, evil but sane, and the deranged, evil but not totally in full responsibility for what they're doing. It's very confusing, isn't it?
It is confusing, but I suppose the answer to that is, how do you define madness? How do you define psychosis, insanity? So if you're saying that somebody doing something extreme that the average person wouldn't consider doing, then almost everybody, Lucy Letby included, would fall into that category if they've taken life for no explicable reason. But importantly, the legal test, so the one that I spoke about, diminished responsibility, there has to be an abnormality of mental functioning that, and this is part of the case law, which arose from a recognized medical condition. And that's the bit that I need to stress, recognized medical condition. So you have to have a diagnosis that's a defined psychiatric diagnosis. So in Calocane's case, we know it was schizophrenia. We know that he was hearing voices. We know that he was having these paranoid delusions. So that is the key. There has to be a psychotic illness that separates one from reality. guilty, and that has to drive the actions, not something like rage or not somebody who's purely bad rather than mad.
How do we know, since so many of us have seen films, movies, read books that feature a schizophrenic, often a paranoid schizophrenic, hearing voices, how do we know that that isn't the first port of call in any murderer's defence? They say, oh, I know what, I'll say I was hearing voices. I mean,
Vanessa,
Go, yes,
sorry
Jeremy.
to interrupt you.
No, you're not. Please tell me.
The answer is it's not first port of call. I mean, having defended in many, many murder trials, I can tell you that the percentage of cases which are resolved by diminished responsibility is minuscule. And, you know, as my colleague has just said, there is a clear distinction between murder cases which are resolved by way of psychiatric diagnosis and the vast majority which are born of rage, are born of crimes of and all kinds of things. The distinction is absolutely monumental as between the categories of homicide cases.
So in other words,
if I can just...
Yes, please do.
If I can just add to that, that's what you're describing, Vanessa, is literally my job. So I'm an expert witness. I would be the forensic psychiatrist that would assess somebody when they're on remand, and I have to make that call.
Yeah.
And the way that I would differentiate between somebody who's trying the system, who's, for example, faking or pretending to hear voices, is looking at the previous psychiatric records. So we know that Calocane had lots of a litany of very bizarre behavior. As you probably know, he went to MI5 trying to hand himself in, asking not to be followed. A couple of years before this event, he was in and out of hospital numerous times. So we look at the history. We don't just take the presentation at face value, and we look for consistency. So if somebody in front of me is telling me they're hearing voices, I don't just believe them. I also ask the prison staff, look through the psychiatric notes. I ask nurses if they're already detained in a psychiatric unit. So we look at all the evidence and we look for consistency.
When people...
It's an incredibly rigorous process.
When people say that they are hearing voices, and you say you ask them about the voices, is there an element often or always of feeling that you have to obey the voices? Because after all, we all hear voices all the time and we don't do what the voices tell us to do. Is there an element of choice in whether you decide to do as the voices tell you, or is there, if you are in the grips of paranoid schizophrenia, no choice? The voice, you hear the voice, it tells you to do something, you must obey the voice.
Sure. So the two different things. So hearing an internal voice that's like your thoughts spoken aloud is not indicative of mental illness. That is a normal experience that most people can have. But a psychotic experience is very different in its nature and its value. So it feels external rather than internal for a start. And to answer your question, some people have command hallucinations. So not everybody with schizophrenia, but a small proportion have these voices that either comment on what they're doing or tell them what to do. And part of their psychotic illness is they feel compelled to listen to them. And these are called command hallucinations.
All right, let me ask you both the same question. I'll start with you, Jeremy Dean. The family, 3 families, obviously feel desperately shortchanged and hard done by and denied closure and denied justice, and they're saying so, and they're saying so with great eloquence and great poignancy, and anybody listening to them absolutely must feel for them. Should you meet them, and you might not, so you can do it now on this programme, Jeremy Dean, Casey, what would you say to them?
What I would say to them, Vanessa, is that the criminal justice process is incredibly complex. It is populated by very high-powered individuals and experts, that I fully understand their disappointment. They may well have good ground to be angry with the CPS. They may well be profoundly disappointed with the police. But in terms of the ultimate result, it was inevitable in the circumstances. This is not an easy option. This guy will get what he deserves, which is that he will die in the most difficult of environments. And in that respect, I hope that they will feel that to a degree justice has been done. Doctor,
what would you say to them?
I think I would echo what Jeremy just said. I can understand why they're really frustrated at the entire system, and I think there's an argument that the mental health services could have observed Calocane more closely, and the police, as we all know, could have arrested him earlier because he was on a warrant for 9 months before the incident. But I actually agree with Jeremy. I think if you look at the medico-legal criteria, Calocane was psychotic at the time of the killing. He is mentally ill. There's a long history of illness. The symptoms that he's he's reported do seem directly connected to his actions. So I do think it's reasonable within the system that we have that he's transferred to a psychiatric unit for treatment rather than prison.
Thank you both very much indeed.